Hello and welcome to The Energy Gang, a discussion show about the fast-changing world of energy. I'm Ed Crooks, and we've got another very special show for you today, recorded for Climate Week in New York City. We are again back at New York University, very kindly hosted by my good friend Amy Myers-Jaffe, and we're in fact in front of one of her classes, a class on climate entrepreneurship, climate tech entrepreneurship. What do you call it? Right, because that is the subject we're going to be talking about today. We have a great lineup of guests to talk about that subject, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. But first of all, Amy, thanks very much for hosting us here again. Great to see you.
Great to see you and great to have you here with my class. Shout out to my students. You'll hear from them maybe as we're talking.
It's also a pleasure to welcome back to the Energy Gang Dan Goldman, who is the co-founder and managing partner at Clean Energy Ventures, which is one of the world's leading energy and climate tech, clean tech investment companies. Dan, thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you, Ed. It's great to be back here. Look forward to talking about an update from, I guess, 18 months ago when I was on last and what's happening in the market.
Yeah, very much so. Very interested to hear your perspectives, as you say, and an update on that conversation we had, as you say, 18 months ago. And it's also a pleasure to welcome a couple of new faces to the Energy Gang. We have Marissa Beatty, who is the founder and chief executive of Turnover Labs. Thanks very much for joining us on the Energy Gang.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
And also in a moment, we're going to be joined by Apoorv Sinha, who's the co-founder and CEO of Carbon Upcycling, and we'll be talking to him in just a moment. Marissa, I wanted to start with you in this conversation. As I say, theme we're going to be talking about today, entrepreneurship in clean tech, climate tech. That's something you've done. You've started your own company. Can you tell us a little bit about that business? What is Turnover Labs? What do you do? And how did you come to start it?
Sure. So Turnover Labs is the company that I started based off of research that was conducted over a number of years at Columbia University on how to improve the durability of electrolysis technologies, so technologies that use electricity to make chemicals. What we're doing is we're building a system that can take contaminated sources of CO2, impure sources of CO2, like what would be coming out of a chemicals facility from standard process operations, and being able to transform that into basic chemical precursors. The idea is that by enhancing the ability of these systems to withstand, industrial operation, industrial impurities, and contamination over long periods of time, we can provide value to the facility based out of their own emissions. So we can both consume emissions that maybe don't have the right profile for capture and sequestration, and then we can turn them into basic chemical building blocks that can also displace new petroleum coming into the facility. The idea is that we can use assets that are already on the ground in order to make more complex molecules to accelerate the energy transition.
That sounds really cool. So, tell me about when you talk about emissions that aren't necessarily suitable for sequestration, what kind of gases are you talking about?
Yeah, so there are different mixtures of CO2 that come out of different processes depending on the host facility that they're coming out of. So there are ones that come out of things like energy generation, which are things like flue gas, but there's also more concentrated sources of CO2 coming from chemical transformation that might have co-pollutants in them like SOx, NOx, and O2. So if they have particular contaminations in them, sometimes that can be a little bit difficult to remove and require excess infrastructure in place. That's, of course, excess energy. That's more capital that has to be deployed for carbon capture. And sometimes that quickly eclipses the cost or the benefit of doing capture. Now, that's just one case. What we're seeing more often is that there are places that are wanting to sort of accelerate their carbon reduction profile. And maybe they don't have transport infrastructure in place, or they aren't located nearby a sequestration site. Well, we're just offering them a way to sort of reduce their carbon emissions for that facility and also get a benefit of being able to make sort of neutral chemicals from it.
So what really made you think there was going to be a business here? As you say, you're working in academic research, you're presumably getting some cool results, you're trying some things and they're working and you're thinking, hey, this is technology that's potentially interesting. How do you make that leap to thinking this is a technology that people are actually going to pay real money for, and it's going to be something that will justify investors putting their capital into because they're going to get a return on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. As a scientist, sometimes you don't consider that aspect of the problem, but it really is something that we evaluated for a long and hard time about whether this technology, the right direction to go with it, was to go through the commercial sort of entrepreneurship journey, or whether it was to keep sort of researching it in an academic context and pursue licensing. I personally believe that the technology that we were working on was really groundbreaking because there are a lot of issues with current electrolysis technologies and the number of situations that they can sort of thrive in. So we saw sort of this area where, okay, this is a universal platform thing that we developed. Which direction do we go into? Well, hydrogen's hot, fuel cells are hot, CO2 management is hot. So there were a lot of things like pull in the field that was sort of a lot of noise that we had to cut through. When I thought about what could really add value to the world and where we are in terms of hitting our decarbonization goals, I saw the most value could be in helping chemical industries look at a new way of sourcing their carbon. And we see a lot of companies that are hitting the ground today that are commercializing CO2 transformation technology, and they're making things like sustainable aviation fuels, they're putting it into things like concrete, but that seemed to be kind of departed from integrating with capital that was already there. So I went around for about a year actually interviewing different chemical companies and just learning about what they were doing about emissions reduction and why maybe they weren't entertaining it as seriously as they should be for certain facilities versus others. And it seemed like there was just a real opportunity for us to build this industrial system for industrial customers. And it was actually motivated about, I wanted to go into this area and what's the best way to do that. And again, we got the feedback that, if you could do something like this, Marissa, that would be really, really great. But you've got this tiny, dinky little cell in your lab, and that's just not at the scale that we would ever be able to take or do anything with. So it was this idea that, okay, there was pull, there was interest, but we needed to grow, and the best way to grow and the quickest way to grow is, of course, infusion of grant funding, which we've gotten a little bit of, but also that's what VC is really positioned for, is if you have downstream pull or demand from customers and you have something that you want to build that you think can make a positive impact, well, they're willing to take a risk and see that technology play out.
And so what stage have you got to now? So you've got a company. Have you been hiring people? Have you got VC funding? Have you gone beyond your, as you say, your small box on your desk? What kind of assets are you building?
Yeah, we have a slightly bigger box on our desk now, so it's still quite small, but it's 1,000 times bigger than what it was even a year ago. So, marginal progress. Yes, we do have VC funding. We have support from a couple of different fellowships that support scientists going into the entrepreneurial space. Sometimes monetarily, other times it's like hand-holding and like coaching. So being able to sort of talk to somebody about the entrepreneurial journey is very beneficial for us. But yeah, we have VC funding. We have a team of 3 full-time engineers, now soon to be 5 full-time over there in Brooklyn in an NYU lab, actually, at Urban Future Labs. And we have a couple of part-time projects going on with different interns and contractors around the city. So we are growing. We're trying to make our dinky cell slightly less dinky and just hit some real milestones for vetting where our technology is strong to perform and where it's not strong. So we're trying to narrow down the wide space that is the chemicals industry into a solid 3 or 4 areas that we could pilot our initial technology.
So I have a question for Marissa, because it's really inspiring what I'm hearing her say. You're getting your PhD, and then you're getting your postdoc, and you're working in the lab, and then you wake up one morning and you think, you know what, I could turn this into a company. And that sounds like something, if you're in Silicon Valley or you're up in Boston, you're hearing like a lot of people doing that. But I have to share with all of you that, a couple years ago, Harvard Business Review published this research that was done at a competition called TechCrunch. And they found that when VC look at the pitch deck for companies, they asked the men to explain what the upside of the business is going to be. So Marissa has explained to all of us the upside of her business. But if we were not enlightened VCs like Dan Goldman, if we were some other kind of traditional VC, we probably wouldn't actually ask her that. What we would have asked her is how she plans to mitigate the risk of her business, and how will she avoid all these potential losses that she's going to rack up in her business. So what did it feel like? Did anybody come to you and say, hey, we're just not going to give money, or they asked you different questions and it put you on the defensive? How did that feel? Or do you think there just isn't something like that for women today? Is it better now?
I can attest that does still happen quite a lot. That article was actually really validating, because it was something that me and other female founders in my network felt. And it was just nice to sort of see concrete data around it, just so that we knew that our experiences were grounded in reality. So it does still happen. I think there's another study that was performed that female founders are more likely to get like twice as much constructive criticism unprompted, or you're more likely to just get unsolicited feedback. And being a founder, you are in a very forward-facing position, and you know, a lot of people see founders and they see all of the wins and the glory that we put out there, but that's really only like 1% of all of it. 99% of it is constructive criticism. How can we be better? What are we failing on? What are we focusing on? So yes, it's been my experience. It is very difficult to get questions that are framed from the beginning, sort of setting you up to fail. This is something that we've had long conversations with amongst my cohort of founders in my program, was basically about answering the question that you think they should have asked in the first place. So if you think they should have asked a question in one way, that would have been, oh, what's your opportunity for growth, rather than how are you going to mitigate all these risks? You can just sort of answer the question that you think was like, oh, I mean, of course there are risks, but the upside of this is so much better. And you just sort of draw around and ignore
Answer
it.
the question you wish you had been asked.
Exactly, yeah. So
I
you
think
just,
that's a great
Yeah.
great strategy, and we hear it often. And
Yeah.
I will say that in our portfolio of 29 companies now, we have about 40% women-led, women-founded, and including several in the electrochemical space, like you're starting, which started from a 4x6 inch single cell electrolysis process. And so we know what it's like to be at the early stage and what the risks are and what the opportunities are and the upside. But considering that, you know, probably 70 or 80% of the applications we get are not female founded, and we have about a little over 40% female founded in our portfolio, I think it's something that, you know, really bodes well for the industry, and we're very proud of that as well.
So I was going to ask you this, Marissa, when you think about the challenges you faced in turning your idea, your concept into a business, what were the biggest obstacles? I mean, so this question, as you say, about being a woman and the particular challenges that women face in the industry may be one of them, but were there other issues that were more important?
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges every single day. There are physical challenges, there are fundraising challenges, there are market challenges. There's just constant on all sides. If I would speak about some of the more difficult ones, I think something that isn't spoken about a lot is I think there's more of a platform for it now, but just sort of the discouragement that you get when there are periods of maybe not as much enthusiasm, or there's some bad news that happens on your particular technology. A larger company with a similar technology, for instance, has issues fundraising, or they have a failure. As a small company, you kind of get swept up in that current too, and then again, you're put on the defensive. So there is a lack of control that you have over a lot of things as an entrepreneur. You can navigate your way as much as you can, and you can try to forge a path, but you are kind of forging out in the darkness, and you don't really have that bright of a lamp. You can only see a little bit far in front of you. So it is very difficult to have conviction about things. So you do have to, I personally, when I would have struggles fundraising, or having struggles just finding the correct team or hiring the correct talent, go back to what I thought was important over and over again. And it's really important to write those things down at the beginning of your journey and make sure that you are constantly reevaluating them. Otherwise, I think you'll just get lost.
Sorry to write. So what do you write down?
I wrote down the core things that I cared about with my company and my technology, and what I wanted it to do, and what I wanted to stand for as an entrepreneur.
Right, really just as a note to yourself to remind you,
Right.
when things got tough, this is why I'm doing this.
Yeah, it's the reason, like, I wanted to see this through to the end. I thought it could have tremendous impact. Nobody's going to do it except for me. I already tried to give it to other people, and it was clear that I was going to be the one who had to do it. So if I wanted to see this change in the world, then I was going to have to forge onto that path. Yeah, and stay true to it.
Yeah, so Dan, I wanted to ask you about exactly this question of the general climate for VC investment in cleantech. I think when we talked 18 months ago, we talked about some of the headwinds, the adverse trends in terms of higher interest rates, generalized sort of anti-ESG sentiment rumbling around the investment industry and so on. How have things changed since then? Has it got better or worse?
Well, I would say it's a bit mixed, Ed. At the macro level, we've had investment in 2022 over the entirety globally, clean climate tech investments of about $1.7 trillion. Last year, we had $1.9 trillion. and the forecasts for this year are $2 trillion. So we're not seeing, I mean, it's going in the right direction, but we're not seeing material growth in the amount of capital being deployed in this sector, a sector that needs somewhere in the order of $6 to $9 trillion a year for multiple decades in order to address climate change. And those are estimates that insurance companies like Swiss Re and Munich Re and investment banks like Goldman Sachs have estimated based on what they see in terms of decarbonizing heavy industry, decarbonizing buildings, decarbonizing transportation. We need a massive amount of spending globally in every country, in every sector, which has never been done before, ever in the history of mankind. So it's a massive opportunity, but it's also a massive challenge. And so what we're seeing at the micro level within the venture community is, again, this bifurcation. There's quite a lot of capital flowing into early stage deals. So getting companies out of the lab, out of the garage, and getting that first capital into companies like Marissa's. And there are a lot of VCs who have a lot of dry powder who want to fund startups. Once you get that company to when it's ready to scale up their technology, that's where there's a gap in the market. What's called the missing middle. Some call it first of a kind financing. This is an area where we really see.
Some call it the valley of death.
The valley of death, the commercialization valley of death. That's what we called it 20 years ago. Still applies today. So that's a real gap in the market. But I will say, I attended an ARPA-E meeting yesterday that Evelyn Wong, the director of ARPA-E, chaired, and I attended another meeting hosted by Munich Re. And I think there's a lot of discussion and a lot of interest in trying to address this first-of-a-kind challenge with financing to get companies out of the lab, build a first-of-a-kind scaled plant where they can then go on and project finance and equity finance large-scale projects in the market. Until you get that first-of-a-kind project built, it's really hard to sign offtake agreements and to get a construction contractor to take the risk of performance, schedule, and cost. So we really need a lot of that capital to help companies scale their technologies. And Apoorv would be a good person to talk about that.
Yeah, Apoorv Sinha, perhaps I can bring you in here. Thanks very much for joining us. So perhaps, first of all, you could tell us a little bit about your company, Carbon Upcycling. What is it you do, and why did you start the company?
Firstly, thanks for having me. My name is Apoorv Sinha. I serve as the CEO and one of the co-founders of Carbon Upcycling. We are a carbon-to-value company focused on decarbonizing the building materials space. So we founded in 2014. We're kind of a bit of an odd story in the sense that we started chasing venture capital and kind of getting to that well after we'd done a bit of that de-risking work. And Dan actually led our seed round and is on our board. And overall, the mission of the company is to become the most impactful carbon-to-value company of this decade. As Dan mentioned, there's a lot of capital that needs to be deployed in this space. And our view is that a lot of the learnings that we're doing with our technology, where we're able to sequester carbon emissions into solid products, in the near term, it's going to help the cement companies decarbonize potentially up to 50, 60% of their baseline footprint. But overall, all the learnings that we have around what we call ex situ mineralization, meaning when you don't have a reservoir to store the CO2 underground, you've got to find some other place to put it into. And we've already proven to a certain extent that we can scale mineralization on the ground. And our mission is really to start with the beachhead cement market and then hopefully help heavy industry overall decarbonize in a more meaningful way.
And so how did you come to start that business? What was your story?
A lot of bad luck, I think. They never tell you how hard it is till you get into the weeds. But so I'm a chemical engineer by training. I did my undergrad at Georgia Tech and was initially involved in the energy sector kind of traditionally. And about a couple of years in, met a couple of co-founders who had sold some successful businesses in the oil industry and was able to get a little bit of that seed capital to get going. And yeah, I think always felt a deep motivation to work in climate and to do something. My dad actually works in oil and gas. He retires later this year. So I think in some ways I'm trying to get the family line to neutralize our overall impact on the environment.
You're trying to take out the carbon that he put in the atmosphere, you mean?
But yeah, that'll be a tall task, but yes, I'll try.
And so, as you said something like, that's been your curse, is to be engaged in this project of entrepreneurship. What have been the biggest challenges? What have been the things you've really had to get over to try and build a business in this sector?
I would say a few. I think first and foremost, I think it goes back to, there's no, at least in our experience thus far, I wouldn't say that there's a single valley of death. There are just a lot of crevasses, and you have to kind of just make sure that you're moving a step at a time. And I think also just being very focused on what your game plan and your strategy is to tackle the market. I think being very active. I think, when you're 6, 7, 8 years into your startup, you're drinking your Kool-Aid pretty hard. And I think being able to step back and really look at what the customer is looking for, and are we solving a real solution, or solving a real problem for them, creating a real solution, and working within the bounds of the environment that you're in. A lot of times what we see, especially in carbon tech and carbon to value work, is, we're wishing for a lot of things to be different, but that may happen, that may not. In fact, some of it could get reversed as soon as 40 odd days from now. So I think working within those bounds and still coming up with a very good strategy. And honestly, I think one of the exciting parts of this trial and tribulation, I suppose, is engaging with partners, whether they be investors or strategic partners that really do see eye to eye with how kind of your mode of change or your kind of thesis of change lines up. I think that's been a huge lesson for us. And so we're constantly trying to talk to as many people as we can to iterate.
Right, so this sounds, Marissa, very much like what you were saying in terms of, as you say, you've got an idea, you've got some science, you've got some technology that works, but knowing whether that's a real business or not, whether that's something that people are actually going to pay money for, is a whole other question. And that just needs, what you're saying, a lot of research, a lot of discussions in the industry, a lot of just getting out there, talking to people to find out what they really need from you and what they're really going to be prepared to pay for.
Absolutely.
And so I would just chime in here and say, Apoorv has done an extraordinary job engaging with the industry. So, he has investors in his companies that are some of the largest cement companies and some of the largest energy companies in the world. He has a lot of them who want to build projects together. He's building his first project in Ontario at one of those cement companies. So, engagement with the industry is just something that entrepreneurs really need to get comfortable with. And that can really make the difference between success and failure. Because if you don't engage with the companies who are the incumbents in the industry, if they're not willing to accept a new technology, it's going to be you're going to be fighting against their incumbent position. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. A lot of incumbents, and particularly in the cement space, they want new technologies. They don't know how to decarbonize their process. They're a huge proportion of our global CO2 emissions. And so looking at a technology like Apoorv has developed is really compelling to them.
So let's just dig into that commercialization gap issue a bit more. I mean, in terms of the stages then that you, Apoorv, and Marissa, you're at, Apoorv, you're obviously a bit further down the line then. Are you now looking to raise the capital to build demonstration projects, to build commercial scale plants? And how, I mean, it feels almost silly asking this question, how easy is that to do? Presumably, as Dan's just been saying, that's a tough thing to manage, to get people to commit to building a lot of physical infrastructure, putting steel and concrete in the ground to actually build a plant. How do you convince people that that's the right thing to do?
Before I answer your question directly, I did want to just make a quick comment on what Dan mentioned about engaging with the strategics. I think one of the lessons we've learned is even within strategics, like one of the big differences between cleantech 1.0, in the vintage of 10, 15 years ago and now, is you do have a lot of strategics that have venture arms. And so they are looking to be a lot more hands-on. Now, what we found, I was thinking about the Gladwell book actually, Talking to Strangers, because in a sense, when you're talking to a venture person at one of these big cement or oil and gas companies, it's not very different from talking to someone like Dan, who understands that we need to do things and there's this urgency and desire to do something. Talking to the stranger at a strategic is actually talking to the plant operator. And you're, getting in the way of a guy who's 7 years away. And I intentionally said guy here because it's almost always guys. And you're talking to someone who's 7 years away from retirement, and you're coming in and saying, hey, you should consider changing something, and getting them to somehow feel okay to take on the pain and misery of trying what you've got has been a very interesting lesson. And, also in building empathy, frankly. But going back to your question about kind of looking at getting them involved at the I guess cusp of proving out the technology at scale. So our Series A last year that we raised with Climate Investments and with BDC, Dan and his team came back into that round as well after having led our seed round. That essentially was the financing that we wanted to raise to build our first of a kind project. So that project in Ontario that Dan mentioned, it's at Canada's largest cement plant. It's just 30 minutes south of Toronto. And we'll be taking local steel slags. So these are currently slags produced as a co-product of making steel. So for every ton of steel that you make with an electric process, like an electric arc furnace, you'll produce about 150 to 200 kilos of these steel slags. And what we have found is that we're able to chemically activate that slag to work as well as its fossil fuel powered cousin, blast furnace slag, so that it can actually be used as a cementitious material. And so we're working with a local steel partner. We're going to have our facility located at the cement plant, and that should be going online within the next 12 months. So by this time next year, we'll have that up and running, and it'll be producing a sizable amount of material. Like, if there are cement people in the room, you won't think this is sizable, but 30,000 metric tons of production a year, which in pretty much any other space would be fully commercial and we'd be good to go. We'd still have to scale probably 3 to 4x on a module before we can really solve this and have a modular unit that we can just bolt on and build parallel trains with. But yeah, I think for us, one of the key kind of criteria and how we put the syndicate together for the Series A was to make sure that the lead investors in particular were coming in with an understanding that heavy industry, first of a kind or second of a kind projects aren't going to be that easy. They aren't going to go exactly according to plan. And they have to stay the course and kind of see the bigger picture. And hopefully we'll deliver on that in the next year or so.
So,
Right.
Apoorv, I have an interesting question for you. Just as a person, it's kind of interesting your story, because here you have your father who was one of these people who's in this incumbent industry. Now, do you think that helped you to go in and convince people in an incumbent industry to try something new? I mean, we've had so many energy gangs about utilities that don't want to try a new technology. Now we're talking about strategics and hard to abate, and we're trying to talk them into using a new technology. Is there a secret sauce? Did it help you that you had to go home at the breakfast table every morning and say, no, I'm not throwing away my years of college as a chemical engineer? I mean, give us a little insight.
If your question is if my dad helped me, the answer is no.
Well, if only by being skeptical, maybe. I'm just asking.
I mean, he was skeptical, I think, a year before Dan put in his check to lead our seed. So he's a pretty, to be fair, if you mean, did he give me the perseverance to stick with someone who never changes his mind and be primed for what I'll be facing in heavy industry, then yes, I think he definitely trained me well. But no more jokes on my dad's expense. I think I would say, I think ultimately it does boil down to just understanding what context these people are making their decisions in. And so, when venture arms are launched, they're usually bringing in people that have a theory of change similar to someone like a Clean Energy Ventures, right? And so we've found those converts, and that's really helped us navigate who are the right people at the different levels of a very hierarchical organization. But I think primarily, there was a period about 5-6 years ago where we'd be like, well, they were just using this to buy time, and they have their own ulterior motive to kind of keep the status quo. And I think what we're realizing is it's not that simple. It's easy to polarize and kind of just get in your bands. But ultimately, if you truly listen and you figure out kind of what are the challenges, I think a lot of, the commercialization value of death that Dan talked about, we have to figure that out as an ecosystem, right? And so we can do our best to kind of nudge the cement companies along, and we can do our best as entrepreneurs to de-risk the technology to a certain stage, bring the capex down so that like that early risk capital is a smaller quantum. But at the end of the day, like it's going to take a village, and we can't just have them as outcasts and say, hey, heavy industry, you're the bad guys, let us make you good again, right? Like I would never have taken that tact with my dad. I definitely don't with heavy industry.
So Marissa, help us. So you obviously facing the same kind of thing in the things that you're trying to do. I mean, does what Apoorv say resonate with you, or you've had a slightly different experience of the same thing?
No, I think our experience has been very, very similar. What was resonating with me about what you said was about approaching things in a very empathetic way. So in our conversations, it's very difficult when you want to learn about what people care about in an industry to not approach it from the sustainability perspective, from the bias of, okay, but you guys really do need to do this. You have to kind of sit back and like sort of quiet that voice in the back of your mind and really deeply listen to what people care about. And then the other thing that you said that I think was sort of analogous in my experiences was, there are people that you fight, and there are people where conversations are a lot easier and they are forward-looking. And these large companies, some of them are looking to the future pretty far in advance and know in some way, shape, or form that they will have to adopt these technologies or adopt these strategies at some point, and they want to get a head start on it. So when you have conversations with people who are forward-looking, that's a lot easier than somebody who, like you were saying, they retire in like 5 years, they don't care, they're never going to see this project when it's fully deployed, they don't get any benefit for it. So it is kind of reading the room and understanding what people in the conversation care about. And again, we're at an earlier stage, so we have to do a lot more storytelling and painting of pictures. But again, these are companies that have existed for a very long time, and they intend to keep existing. So if they want to be at the front of their curve and competitive in their field, then they are incentivized to engage with us early on and make sure that we're developing technologies that are helpful to them as well.
And that kind of engagement, I think, is one of the things that's really interesting about what's happening today in terms of clean tech investment, what you might have called clean tech 1.0 if you go back to the 2000s, when it felt like there were quite a few people from the software world that thought, we've created these amazing innovations here. This is expertise that is transferable. We are concerned about climate change. We want to work on decarbonization. We think we can transform the energy industry. And there are a lot of very crucial differences between software and energy that people missed. And that whole cliche about move fast and break things. If you move fast and break things in energy, you can do a lot of damage. You can kill people. In the worst case outcomes, you can destroy very expensive facilities, lose enormous amounts of money. So just that whole way of working, fail fast, then try again, aim for rapid disruption of an industry, that's just not going to work, is it?
I think it can work in some areas and not in others. So I think you're dead on in saying that, there are different safety considerations when you're getting a first of a kind plant on board. We have to get permits for things. We have to figure out safety considerations for these plants. And a lot of times, these are young entrepreneurs who have maybe never built anything before, and now they're suddenly tasked with doing, large hydrogen projects. So what does that look like if you don't have sort of a guiding hand or a measured response to evaluating stuff? You can't just run at a problem at full force and just force everybody to adopt it. So that's, in a way, I think it's different. But I think there are a lot of similarities to like mentality about like finding new avenues or finding paths of least resistance that we can sort of piggyback on top of as hard tech founders. But yes, I think there is a different consideration when it comes to the timescales, and that's something that I think VC in a lot of ways has had to adapt to. There's a lot more assets, there's a lot more money that has to go towards developing these projects. And I think it took some time, but VC really is in a place to understand like longer timescale returns and higher, larger fundraisers to accommodate for that.
Yeah, I would just add, I think today we see the need for this combination of technology, policy, and finance to really be successful. Technologies are there. We see thousands of technologies, and there's lots of venture capital to back them. The finance is starting to get there, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then the policy side of it is incredibly important. Not only Europe, US, but also other countries and to have consistency of policies. And that's one of the challenges I think we have in the US, where we change administrations every 4 years and we have different energy policies. We now have an Inflation Reduction Act, Ed, that is catalytic to so many things that can address climate change. But we don't know if that's going to be here for the long term. And it's really essential that it is. And then, on the finance side, I think it's been quite interesting to see the leaning in by the investment banks to figure out how to structure growth capital. And we've seen recently, just in the last couple of weeks, some really significant financings. One fuels company, $640 million. Another fuels company, $1.1 billion. Our company, Ncycle, which does critical minerals recovery, raised a bunch of money and built a first project in Ohio. So, that's a first commercialization right there. And we're seeing that happening in storage. We're seeing it happening in new battery technologies. We're seeing it in geothermal now. Microsoft, Southern California Edison giving Fervo an offtake agreement. And I don't think you can understate the need for customers, right? In these markets, you have to have underwriting with customers that are willing to buy your product. If you can get that underwriting of customers, you're likely to be able to raise the capital if you have a good technology. And we're seeing that in our portfolio. We're seeing it really across the industry now.
Going back to your point about the importance of policy, if a business depends on the right policy to be successful, isn't that fundamentally a bad business? I mean, it just feels like in a democracy, governments will change, policies will change. Nothing is going to last forever. No system of tax credits, incentives, whatever else it might be, is going to last indefinitely. You have to be surely resilient to that.
Yeah.
You have to be robust through a political cycle.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, but I think if we want to bring costs down for hydrogen, if we want to bring costs down for sustainable aviation fuel, we want to bring storage costs down. We have brought wind and solar costs down. How did we do that? Through renewable energy credits, through tax incentives like the production tax credit. That's brought wind and solar down to a place where it's highly competitive, if not much lower cost in many places with conventional energy sources.
So I have to weigh in here on America, right? Because a lot of the technologies that we're all whining about, we have to rely on a supply chain from some other country, and we're uncomfortable with that. It's because we developed the technology here, and then no one was willing to do, everybody kind of had, Ed, your attitude, which is like, oh, well, I just can't wait for this thing becomes commercial, so I'm not going to invest. And so some other country said, okay, come to our country and deploy your technology. And now they're ahead in that technology, and they scaled it, and the cost came down incredibly, and now we're buying that. So now we're dependent on that supply chain. So there really has to be, I think, a deeper conversation in this country. It's not even about the polarization about am I going to prioritize climate change or not climate change. This is about long-term U.S. economic competitiveness. I would say maybe not so much with some of these hard-to-abate technologies, but at some point, a lot of the technologies we're talking about are dual-use technologies. They're technologies that our military would need to have and use to keep us safe. So, in the American discussion, we really need to focus on the fact that these investments we're making in having a competitive economy, for the long term. And, people have all these charts about jobs today and jobs 10 years ago and all this stuff. That's not relevant. What's relevant is in 10 years hence, where are the jobs going to be, right? Where are the supply chains going to come from? And do we have people like you all visiting with us today and my students here in the audience that are going to keep us positioned to be competitive as a country? And I think we really need to face that and focus on that in the policy domain.
We don't want to outsource anything else to China. Industrial policy, and I consider the Inflation Reduction Act industrial policy, needs to create supply chains domestically for our resilience and for our economic benefit. So 100% agree that it's not just about the climate. The climate's absolutely critical, but we also need to have a domestic economy that takes advantage of our innovation.
Correct, and that innovation creates jobs here where we're making something, and then that's our export market, right? So it really is about a forward-facing way of thinking about jobs and our own supply chains, and not having a situation where we need to be making steel or cement or anything else, and we can't get it from the market in some, state of affairs because, we're just importing everything.
Apoorv, you mentioned this a moment ago. You talked about how the US could very soon be set on a different course, a very different course for energy and climate policy. How might that affect you? What's the significance of that for carbon upcycling?
Not very much, to be honest, for us, because we're competing on helping our cement partners create optionality in their supply chains. And so our core value proposition to these companies is, they've been relying on coal ash from coal power plants or blast furnace slag from blast furnaces. These are already outsourced to other places. And to what Dan said about the renewable energy transition, a lot of base load coal power has already been turned off. And so these staple cementitious materials that helped the cement industry kind of keep their emission profile low has already been kind of becoming more and more scarce. And back in 2021 or so, everyone was like, well, maybe it's a blip in the radar and it's going to come back. Well, no, like coal power plants aren't coming back, blast furnaces aren't coming back. And so for us, I think that keeps it going. And I think just to the point that was made about local jobs and local production, I mean, one of the things that really resonated with me, I was at a bank's kind of investment banking conference here a couple of weeks ago, and there was this notion of Factory America, like building the things that we need here. And they were saying that this is the one thing that maybe is going to be bipartisan, right? Like, if you can, like right now, about 25% of cement or building materials, or cementitious building materials in the States come from offshore. They're not coming from China. They're coming from Mexico or Italy or Greece or Turkey. Saudi exports not just oil, but they export 3 million tons of cement to the EU every year, right? Because while they get their mega infrastructure projects going, they've got to get that cement going somewhere else. So I think overall, we're already seeing in the EU with CBAM that they're going to try to kind of, correct that to a certain extent, or at least get it to the same level of kind of standards and regulatory kind of scrutiny as they have the local players under. And I think from our perspective, I think this is a virtuous cycle, because as that 25 million tons of cement gets onshored, as it's produced locally with new technology, hopefully, but as that is going online, that's creating local jobs that were otherwise being produced somewhere else. And every new job that's produced there is more likely to believe in the energy transition as being a force for good, not just, at a climate level, but I think as was being said at an economic and a social level as well.
Yeah, that is a very interesting point.
Oh, I was going to say that I agree. We have a very similar value proposition beyond decarbonization that is very central to supply chain and availability of resources. And I just wanted to circle it back that I think since we are discussing, sustainable technologies, when you have these vast centralized supply chains where you're moving things thousands of miles from one area to another, that's susceptible to a lot of issues. And I think, everybody confronted that during the COVID pandemic. But also, when these supply chains rely on, infrastructure that is sensitive to changes in temperature or maritime shipping, increasing, flexibility or increasing variation in daily temperatures can cause issues in these pipelines that cause failure, or in cases where you're shipping things vast distances, increasing tropical storms can also affect the prices of things. So I think people sort of anticipate that these supply chains are going to be more variable over time. And that's also a good reason why a lot of people are interested in sustainable solutions where they can look at things in a more decentralized fashion.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point. Thanks. So let's take some questions from the class then now, I think. Do you want to hands up if you've got a question? We have a mic we can bring to you.
My specific question is for Dan. Given that a lot of these companies are mostly solving issues in the facilities industry side of things, would you say there are any companies that we as an everyday consumer should be on the lookout for where we would be able to implement their technology in an everyday basis?
That's a great question. So I think most of what we invest in is more on the B2B side, so business to business. But I think eventually you're going to see signs on sidewalks that say that this is low carbon cement. Cities are going to start to promote where they're adopting sustainable solutions. And so I think more and more we'll be seeing that. I think an area that we're very focused on that ultimately will become consumer products oriented is in the sustainable plastics and polymers space. So looking at, PET, which goes into most bottles, or polyethylene and polypropylene, which go into a bunch of other products. We are looking at a lot of different technologies that can make those products sustainably. So I think we'll start to see some labeling around carbon footprint of consumer products, and I think it's then going to be up to the consumer as to whether they pay attention to that. I'm confident that particularly this generation will be engaged in those and look for more sustainable products in the market. So yeah, definitely something we're looking at, but we're much more on the B2B side, the background products that then ultimately become consumer products.
Hi, thank you everyone. So my question is like, how do you, when are you pressured to build a pilot plan, and how much money do you need for that? Also, how can you prove your scalability, and how to clarify your project viability?
Who wants to take that one first?
Yeah, there's a lot of
Apoorv?
questions.
Yeah. Well, do you want?
I was going to say Marissa can go first.
Oh, I mean, I haven't made a pilot plant yet, so I might not be the most well-positioned person
Well, maybe
to
you
answer
can talk
this.
about how you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, when it comes to determining scalability, there are cases that you can point to. So a lot of technologies in bio will point to other similar companies that have come before them and scaled into bio. So they'll point to technologies where they might have overlap with something that might have already scaled into pharmaceuticals production. When it comes to more niche things off the edge of it, you kind of have to get a little bit more back to basics and really address if you do think that's scalable and making decisions about if that's scalable. So, for example, we had a technique for what we were doing in our lab for how we were preparing some of the components in our system. And it was something that was really popular, like more commonly done in academic situations. And we sat down and we thought about, is this the best way that we should be building this right now? Because what are we going to do if we have to make this slightly larger? Well, we're going to have to buy a massive system that's millions of dollars, and I don't necessarily want to marry ourselves to that technique right now. So you do kind of have to be forward-looking and on the lookout for ways that you could get tripped up when it comes to scaling, and be able to speak about that confidently to investors and to customers, that you have certainty around that, as much certainty as a startup can have.
And there was another aspect of that question I thought was interesting, was the question about kind of timing. When do you have to get to commercial scale project of some kind? Is there a kind of a clock ticking that puts you under pressure to get there within a certain time?
Never, ever run out of money.
That sounds like good advice.
Yeah, I mean, the pressure about getting money, getting customers, I think startups should be pushing themselves to get into the marketplace as quickly as they can. So in some cases, that could just be a function of where your technology is. Are you able to deploy a plant at a scale that a customer would find meaningful? Well, that might dictate when you do that pilot plant. The other side of it is, if you're somebody who's minded for impact, there could be timing around certain policy decisions that you could take advantage of. So maybe a pilot plant wasn't economically viable in one situation, but then you get some supporters from the government and it kind of changes things around, and you can deploy a lot earlier. So it is a function of where your team is at, if you're able to do that, where your money's at, where the market's at, and where policy is at. So you just have to sort of be mindful of all of those different factors before you make that jump.
I would add a couple other things. I mean, there's a thing called technology readiness level, TRL, and that's a rule of thumb, and it's been used in the engineering world for decades and decades. And so many companies follow that process of scaling, and you definitely don't want to scale too quickly, like going from a 1 ton per day to 1,000 ton per day would be too fast to scale up, too large a scale up. And so managing that risk profile, but also doing so within the capital raising process that you need to undertake. What milestones do you need to meet at each stage of your capital raising, Series Seed, Series A, Series B, and what risks can you take to scale the technology as fast as possible, but within engineering guidelines as well? And Apoorv knows this better than I do.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Apoorv, for your experience on this. How are you feeling these pressures?
Well, maybe I'll start with a really simple question. Like, when do you need to build a pilot plant? I would say as soon as you can. Like, we wanted to build ours like 10 years before we founded the company. Because, I mean, if you don't, then you're not going to realize the impact. So if you go back to the mission and what you're trying to drive and some of the urgency that's been talked about at length here, I mean, we have to build and iterate and, you know, kind of try as best we can the lean startup method in this space, right? So that one's easy. Like, just build as quickly as you can. And then I think, you know, I'll talk about two other books. There's this one book by Ben Flivberg, an Oxford University professor, How Big Things Get Done. And then there's another one which just talks about the philosophy of building this, which is on grand strategy, where the author talks about, you know, balancing aspirations with capabilities. And so I think to what Dan said, you know, you don't want to take insane engineering or technical risk or even fundamental like science risk sometimes, right? Like, you're not going to build a nuclear fusion reactor that's interlinked with the grid next year if you don't know if you have enough fuel supply to feed your plant, or if you know if it's, you know, producing positive energy on a control volume basis. In our case, you know, we're sizing our plant in Ontario as per the limitation that our partner has on what they can confidently get out to the market without taking undue market risk. So, you know, we started at a number, they had another one, and you listen, like, you go back to the empathy point that you were making earlier, and you're, you know, you say, you know what, like, you're just trying to lowball us, you're trying to slow us down, and then it's like, no, actually you're not. Like, you're just saying, I'm not going to build a plant and commit to buying a bazillion tons of your material if the market's only going to take, you know, 20,000 or 30,000 tons a year off my plate, right? So I think it's interesting how the market the free market just equilibrates a little bit. But I think going back to the comment that Dan was making about policy, I think a little bit, I'm a chemical engineer, so I think about activation energy. I don't necessarily think public policy is going to be creating necessarily in its best form, if done right. It's not going to create, zombie companies that, never become cost competitive. But if it helps us get through that hump to then start going down the cost curve, because economies of scale kick in, the lessons, China's adoption of solar, drove costs down by 3 orders of magnitude within 3 decades, right? And that only happened because they had that patient support over that time. And then after that, it needed no support at all. And I absolutely, at least in what I see in heavy industry, I think there are technologies like that can do that. And yeah, I think that needs to be supported through that early phase.
And everybody forgets there were a lot of Chinese solar manufacturing companies that went bankrupt, right? So it wasn't some perfect course there just because they had a really definitive policy. It's hard because the market has to be there for internal and export.
Yeah, that's a great point. As you say, there were successes, but also many failures in that industry. And actually, companies in that industry are having a hard time right now, right? Because of
100%, same thing.
So exactly. Although it's in one sense a success story, it's still commercially pretty difficult. Yeah. That's a great point. Also, I have to say that book, How Big Things. What is? I need to get the title right. How Big Things Get Done, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. You must be about the 20th person I've heard recommending that. I must read it.
I think it's just because it's an easy read.
Right. Yeah. But it does sound good.
Yeah.
No, I must track it down. It's embarrassing. I haven't read it yet. A question over there.
Thank you. I had a policy-related question. I feel like a few times, several of you have mentioned kind of policy windows and taking advantage of those. I'm curious to hear about how startups like yours do that, and how startups in general are taking advantage of policy windows created by things like the IRA and that kind of catalytic action that was mentioned.
You want to go, Apoorv? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I'll go. I would say it's been, we honestly have not done that as well as we would like. Like, in hindsight, we would have been more proactive on it. But I would say maybe a general statement I would make is, as an earlier stage company, you have less, influence on how that's done. As you build up capacity, we're at 43, 44 people now. And so we've now been able to get, government relations firms to kind of educate us, and in turn, educate some of the policymakers around what type of things really matter. And I think, in the last 6 months alone, I think the amount of learning that we've had on how to tell our story, how to get the strategic partners we have to tell their story, to drive that meaningful kind of change in the near term, like in a 1 to 3 year time period. We've gotten significantly better at that just with capacity. And so, yeah, I think it just evolves would be my answer.
Marissa, how important is policy to you?
I would say as an early stage company, it is quite difficult. You don't have a lot of control over things. The analogy that comes to mind is if policy was like a wave and you're a surfer sitting in the water, then you have to be the one who determines when to paddle on it. So as an early stage company, you are very flexible, you are very nimble. If you start seeing a lot of signals, whether it's coming from grants or from particular policies that are being applied in industries that you think you're relevant to, you need to be mindful of that and determine if that's the path that you want to go towards. There could be windows where you could get a lot of grant funding because the government is prioritizing the development of that technology. So that's sort of how we're responding to changes in policy. It is very difficult until you start getting things on the ground and you're a little bit more exposed from that position. But early on, it can have an effect on your trajectory.
Dan, what about you? Do you think you're actually in a position to influence policy at all? Do you have a voice that gets heard?
I think so. I think we and the rest of the industry, our views are valued by folks like ARPA-E and others in the Department of Energy because they're looking to say, how can our capital be catalytic to this industry? And so we say, there's a gap in this market, or this technology area needs more early stage support, needs science support to get things out of universities and labs. So we find that we can influence policy, not specifically in a sort of like corrupt way for our own companies, but more for the industry as a whole. And that ultimately can lead to us to invest in those areas just like others can as well.
And as you say, if your broad objectives are aligned with those of the administration, the government wants to get to a particular place, wants to get to decarbonized industries, wants to get to steep reductions in emissions overall, as you say, they need the private sector to head in that same direction with them to make that happen.
Exactly. And then whether that's, new programs on geothermal, advanced geothermal, or programs on fusion and fission, these are really super important for the industry as a whole.
And Ed, oftentimes, whether it's DOE or the national academies, they're called on by government to create roadmaps. And when they're doing that road mapping exercise, they specifically go out to private sector to try to understand, what's possible, what's out there, how long is it going to take, what are the specific scientific breakthroughs, whether that's technical or fundamental science that are needed along this roadmap. And that's like a big part of what the federal government brings to the table.
I hear the Washington Square drumming has started for the afternoon.
Yes.
That's a good bit of New York atmosphere, just proving we are really here.
Yeah, we really
in
are
York
here at
City.
NYU.
Yeah,
If you
absolutely.
listeners, you can hear it in the background.
Exactly. I think maybe we've got time for one or two more questions. I think we do have one there. Actually, sorry, I can see more than two hands up. But yeah, anyway, we'll get to everyone.
So at an event on Monday at 30 Rock, there was a meeting with John Podesta and institutions including 14 banks with Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, and Citi. They indicated their support for the COP28 goal of tripling nuclear energy by 2050. What do you think the role of entrepreneurs is in this renewed focus on nuclear energy?
Yeah, very interesting question. Dan, probably one for you.
Yeah, I can start. We have not made nuclear part of our venture strategy, but we watch it very closely, and we are big supporters of nuclear development. I think there's a real opportunity for small modular reactors to play an important role in the future. That said, we watch China develop 20, 30 nuclear reactors, large-scale nuclear reactors every couple of years. And we have a real problem in this country with the approval process. And so there has been bipartisan support for reforming how we approve nuclear power projects, because it literally takes hundreds of millions of dollars just for the approval process, and then 5 to 10 years for every project. It's not a tenable way to scale nuclear energy in this country. And we are seeing tremendous development of new technologies. We're seeing a lot of private sector investment in new technologies. But the biggest concern is, how long is it going to take for my investment, my reactor, to get to market. Many of you will know that Bill Gates is a huge proponent, a huge investor in nuclear energy. We are co-investors with Breakthrough Energy Ventures, but we are not doing nuclear at this point, but we really support their risk capital going into that sector.
Right, because I was going to say, in terms of those challenges I was discussing earlier in the energy industry, in terms of safety, public acceptance, just building enormous projects, nuclear kind of feels like the ultimate example of that, right? These are
Right.
tens of billions of dollars potentially for reactors. As I say, all those issues around public acceptability, safety, very, very live in nuclear. It just feels like an impossibly difficult area for VC investment to play, doesn't it? I mean, as you say, Bill Gates is doing it, but Bill Gates is doing it because he can afford it. He can afford to lose the money if it doesn't work, and because he has... It's a philanthropic thing for him, right? He's not really thinking about it as a commercial investment, is he? He's thinking that he wants to tackle climate change, and he believes that innovations in nuclear power are the best way to address that. It's not, as I say, is he really expecting a payout from that
I
investment?
think he's expecting a payout, Ed.
Do you think?
I think so, too.
I
Okay.
do. I mean, I think that, there's a whole school of business, and the idea behind small modular reactor is that you're going to try to standardize some of the building process so that not everything is a cookie cutter plant where it's got unique designs, and I got to take all those designs to this whole level of regulation and regulators and approval and permitting processes, but that I could prove out some of these designs and then get that approved, and then it's going to accelerate and speed up the process of deploying the technology. So I think that they're kind of believers, and I think they've had a little bit bad luck because everybody was counting on this inexpensive Russian uranium, and of course that didn't come to pass because of the conflict in Ukraine. But in the end, a lot of people are talking in the United States, and they're talking about, obviously, more recently going back to sites that were plants that were closed and either refurbishing them or trying new technologies on that same site. I do think there's a lot of hype and discussion. It almost feels like hydrogen in terms of this sort of gusto for thinking through, could we reopen a plant, or could we build something on the site in complementary with the plant, or I just think there's a lot of activity.
We've seen recent announcements with 3 Mile Island being reopened, and we've seen Microsoft committing to data center nuclear development. And so, I think the fortunate thing is that Bill Gates, whether he wants to earn a return on that or not, I don't know, but I know he wants to earn a climate return on that. And he truly believes that that is an essential component for addressing climate change.
What about you, Marissa Apoorv? Did you ever think about the nuclear industry as an area where you might like to develop something?
Yeah, well, we're both relying on electrochemical technologies, so the availability of clean electrons is, of course, directly related to the success of our companies and the impact that our companies can have. So we do keep an eye on where we can get sources of sustainable energy, and the more that comes online, the better it is for us. The other thing I was going to say is that your question was about how startups can enable this growth of nuclear assets coming on. And these are massively complex systems. There are hundreds and thousands of components within these systems, and there are startups in the space that are really innovating around pieces of technology that maybe haven't been innovated on in a while. So I'm aware of a couple that are essentially working on fasteners that go into these reactors. Other people are working on higher tolerance insulation. So there is, it might not be an entire nuclear plant, but there is availability. Like anytime there's an opportunity or a growing market, startups do rise to that opportunity quite frequently.
Right,
I have to tell us a quick story. So I was asked to meet with a group of students from Babson College. They're business students, 21 years old, way before Bill Gates was thinking about nuclear. And they say to me, Mrs. Jaffe, we'd like your advice. We'd like to create a nuclear startup. We think that there hasn't been a startup in nuclear for a really long time. And they had this concept that there were designs that were sitting around in national labs in the United States, and that there's new materials today and new science, and maybe they could find one of those technologies and commercialize it. And the end of the story, short end of the story, is that through their journey, they got together with someone who's now their CTO, who designed small reactors for the Navy, for submarines. And they have a commercial company. That at one point they got seed money from DOE, and I think that they're kind of on the cusp of trying to sort of commercialize what they're doing. And I remember at the time when this young man was 21 and the other people working with him, we all used to roll our eyes behind his back. But it's amazing, 10 years out, I think he might wind up having a company that builds a plant.
We have several more questions which we should try and get to. I think one in the front here.
Thank you for the opportunity for being here. I have a question for Mr. Goldman, especially from the VC point of view. When you are for your portfolio, like, is there like any specific climate metric when you are about to invest in like climate tech industry? And what about the climate startup that they're very like in the early stage, they don't have traction yet. They have a very big potential in terms of like profitability and stuff, but like they have to have a huge investment up front in terms of technology, especially when they are doing such like carbon removal, carbon sequestration, and stuff like that. They probably need a huge investment. Like, what is your specific metrics for that?
That's a great question. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are very mission driven. And so we look at every opportunity through two lenses. One is, can this be a financially successful company? Can it grow to scale, be a market leader? And coincident with that, if it can do that, can it reduce material amounts of greenhouse gases? And so we have an internal tool called Simple Emissions Reduction Calculator, and we use that during diligence to assess what the implications are of this technology getting to the market. So some technologies are direct carbon reduction, like carbon upcycling. Some technologies are enabling technologies like line vision, which does transmission line monitoring. So what does that do? It allows more renewables, more solar and wind to get onto the transmission grid, because it allows utilities to better understand their carrying capacity through dynamic line rating. So every company we look at is through those two lenses, and our goal is to fill what we call the energy or the climate innovation gap between the Paris Accord and what we need to get to meet a 2.0 degrees temperature in the atmosphere. And so that gap is very large. Our fund is clearly not going to be the only one that contributes to it or is able to solve it, but we want to be a material part of that reduction. So not every company also is going to be successful, so we have to think about it as a portfolio approach. And this 2.5 gigaton cumulative reduction from the time we invest to 2050 is the metric that we've set for each company. And so during diligence, like I said, they have to prove to us that that is a reduction. And so as we're looking at these companies, we're very hands-on to help them figure out how to go to market and how to be successful. And to the second part of your question about the capital intensity, we tend to look at companies that are lower capital intensity, or if they are project developers like carbon upcycling, like Nth Cycle, like electrified thermal solutions, we want to see alternatives, because you never know how the private equity markets, how the growth capital markets, like how the debt capital markets are going to perform in the future. And so what their risk tolerance can be uncertain. We saw this through the first wave of climate tech, where the growth capital dried up. And so it left a lot of companies out there who wanted to develop projects with no source of capital. And so we look at licensing models and other ways to sell equipment to incumbents in the industry as something that is almost like a fallback solution if those capital markets dry up and we have to rely on the lower cost of capital from large incumbents in the cement industry or the steel industry or the oil industry. But so it's a very important part of our diligence to look at that capital intensity of a business and how you're going to grow that business over time with low cost of capital.
It's been a fascinating discussion, but unfortunately we do have to leave it there. I think we are out of time, sadly. But thanks very much for joining us, all of you. Paul, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Marissa, thank you.
Thank you.
Dan, great to see you again.
Thank you.
And Amy, thank you very much indeed for hosting us here again today.
Always great to have the Energy Gang at NYU.
Indeed it is, always fantastic. Thanks very much to our producers, Dan Cottrell and Toby Biggins-Gilchrist. And many thanks to all of you for listening. Thanks very much to everyone in the class who's been listening to us and contributing such great questions. And thanks to all of you listening out there in cyberspace. Look out for the Energy Gang again soon with all the latest news and views from the energy transition. Until then, goodbye. Thank you.